Hello, everyone. Am I clearly visible and audible? Okay, so I'm going to briefly introduce myself, then give a roadmap for the workshop. My name is Ayal Mor. I've been a competitive debater for almost 7 years now and a competitive debate coach at schools for almost 6. I currently coach at 5 universities. I'm a big fan of debate, and I'm a big believer that debate is something that should be broken down, learned, and understood like any other academic field. I think that it has a lot of nuance and complexity that we can only learn by going through workshops, by doing drills to practice the specific skills that workshops talk about, and that we don't get just from doing round after round. So I'm very glad you're all here today. I encourage you to take notes. I encourage you to participate when I ask questions. So there'll be moments during the workshop that I will give you 2 minutes to think, and then I'll ask you for your answers. It is very important when we're practicing skills to be implementing and not just observing. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about mechanization. Before that, we're going to talk about burdens, because that's how we'll understand what we want to mechanize. If we'll have time for it at the end, we're going to talk about framing. The entire workshop will have an emphasis more on positive speeches, so more on mechanizing and burdens and framing, if we get to it, in leaders, deputies, and members, and less so in whips. I want to start by talking to you about what mechanizing is and what framing is, because these are words that get thrown around, but sometimes it's difficult for us to really understand and keep a clear view in mind. Then what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk a lot about burdens, how we identify them, how we select them, and how we define them. Then we're going to talk about how we mechanize and prove burdens and how we're able to come up with our mechanisms. Finally, we're going to talk about how we do deepers using better mechanization. So let's start with the definition of framing and mechanizing. Mechanizing, or meching out a burden, is just the process of explaining how X leads to Y, how something leads to something. Now, always in debates, we want to claim that things change, that there's a difference between the two sides of the house, and that the motion is what causes this change. As a result, we want to claim some terminal endpoint change, X, that is a product of initial change, Y, which is what happens in the motion. And we do that using mechanisms, using separate pieces of explanation to explain why X leads to Y. In a more general way, mechanisms are proof of a burden. So my burden doesn't have to be X leads to Y. My burden could also be that X is the crucial population when determining Y. And I can mechanize why this population has the most end influence. Generally, every burden we want to explain, other than, for instance, our impacting, which will typically just be not mechanizing, but rather illustrating what the outcomes of something is, it's going to be a mechanization burden. Now, framing, on the other hand, is illustrating that something is true. Not necessarily true as a product of something else, just that it's true in the world. These are things that we don't want to claim change as a result of the debate, even if we think that they will be a reason to defend one side of the debate rather than another. I want to frame something that is true on both sides, which means that on my side, I get to unlock it. So, for instance, framing what do people vote on is different than trying to mech out why a specific motion or specific change will lead to people changing their votes in certain ways. Framing how wealthy a given country is, or what its industrial makeup is, so what industries make it up, is going to be separate from trying to mech out how a motion turns a country more wealthy or changes its industrial makeup. Now, oftentimes, these bits of framing are useful in order to illustrate what the world looks like before our arguments come in, before our mechanizations start happening. The problem is, oftentimes people give 4 points of framing. They want to talk a lot about what the world is and almost just get to claim at that point, this leads to my impacts. There are many teams that stand up and start with framing and then move on to impacts and forget to do the crucial part of mechanizing in the middle. Now, I think almost any point of framing one does in positive speeches should be integrated into a burden, trying to prove something, an analytical step that is a clear step on the process to our bottom line. And I think that this is important because speakers often lose track of how many framings they give and don't reference them later on. Judges struggle to understand, because framings sort of sit outside the natural flow of burdens that lead into each other, what they're supposed to do with those burdens. And so you're very reliant on how the judge is going to interpret it and how they're going to react to it. Which was the third thing I wanted to say. And most importantly, it makes us lazy. It means that instead of practicing proving our burdens, we tend to assert them more as just things that are true, instead of proving that these things actually happen. The rule of thumb, the golden rule for when something gets to remain a framing for me is, one, if it is a framing that is relevant to multiple arguments in my speech. If it's relevant to a single argument in my speech, I'm going to put it in that argument at the point at which that framing burden is relevant. That is the only way for me to be able to rely on the judge and myself being able to understand how it fits into the argument. For instance, as I get into an argument of this changes people's votes, then I might start with a burden of what do people vote on in the absence of this, which is going to be a very framing heavy burden, but I can still treat it as more analytically rigorous in terms of what's expected of me. So in conclusion, the second criteria for having a framing outside our speech, other than it being relevant to multiple arguments, outside our points, other than it being relevant to multiple arguments, is if it can have clear and concise names. If a framing is a way that I want to illustrate the world, then I'm going to want to be able to reference that later on in my burdens, where I utilize the fact that I proved that the world looks a certain way. So I'm going to want anchor words, that what I'm proving in the framing is trying to prove that those anchor words are applicable. So an anchor word, it might be just 2 words that I want you to keep in mind about the actor I'm framing. And then I'll be able to reference those 2 words later on in my speech. And if something is relevant to multiple arguments and I can create anchors with it, I can turn it into some core claim that I'm trying to frame to be true that I can easily reference, then it makes sense to have it as framing at the top of our speech. Note, framing can also do many other things, right? I can frame out other people's arguments. I can use framing in order to prove certain weighings. There are many ways that we use framing outside of this, but when we think about how we use framing in order to prove positive material, rather than how we use framing in order to engage with others, this is the core way we approach framing. Okay, having said that, I want to now talk about how we identify burdens in order for us to know what we need to mechanize. I want to talk quickly about what burdens are and why we have to use them. And then I'm going to talk quite a bit about how we find them. Then we're going to circle back to how we mechanize and prove them. Burdens are the subclaims that construct an argument. If I prove each of those subclaims, then the argument is proven. It is typically the minimal set of subclaims that are required in order to prove that an argument is correct. An argument stands. For an argument to stand, it has to be the logical conclusion of the burdens that we've proven. If it's not, then we have a logical leap. So I hope this is clear enough, and I do want to make sure I have time for everything. So I'm not going to do every last bit of the explanation in what are burdens. But the basics of it is, let's say I want to claim Jane uses an umbrella right now. I'm going to think, what are the minimal set of claims required to prove that? I'm going to go, Jane owns an umbrella. Jane uses the umbrella while it's raining. It is currently raining. So all of those, or alternatively, a more minimal set would be, it is currently raining. When it is raining, Jane uses an umbrella, right? making sure that we don't miss any of those is crucial for the argument to stand, and if we don't do that, that becomes the easiest place to attack. But then that's the easy part, because once we've identified the correct burdens, an argument is only true if we prove the burdens are each true. So that is why mechanization is so important, because it's the exclusive way to prove arguments. Now, burdens of proof are really important for us to use. They help us to be more efficient and prove a case in less time. So it helps us know when we've given enough reasons to a single burden and we can move on to another burden. We're always allowed to add more reasons to something, right? The easiest way to know whether we have enough on something or whether we should now focus our attention to something else is to work with burdens and think to ourselves comparatively which of our burdens is currently most and least proven. Burdens of proof help us be more immune to rebuttals. So the clearer we identify our burdens, the better we prove and execute our burdens, the harder it is to respond to us. And it is a very important way. It is the only way to do vertical extensions. So we need to either be filling in a missing burden, so identify that something is a missing burden, prove that it is a missing burden. I'll give a little later on an example of a good frame, gladly. Prove a missing burden. Sorry. Just the message. No worries. Feel free to send messages. Just distract me for a second. Yeah. So we either have to prove that something is a missing burden, an important burden, and prove it, or we have to prove already standing burdens that have already been proven to a greater extent and explain why that difference in extent means that we deserve credit for the argument. So let's say our opening proved incentive, but they didn't prove capacity. We're going to prove capacity. Is an easy way to win. But if our opening already proved incentive and capacity, but they proved capacity to a pretty weak extent, the way for me to win over them is to prove capacity to a far greater extent by mechanizing far better why there is capacity. And then I get to claim, look, I've proven this argument to over 2 times the margin that my opening have proven it. I have contributed more to proving this argument than they have. That's in terms of why we need to use burdens of proof. Before I talk about finding burdens of proof, I'm happy to give a quick illustration of what a frame is. So in a motion like this House believes that the election of Trump is in the interest of China, then I need to mechanize how American policy affects China, how American foreign policy affects China, how American economic policy affects China, how American domestic policy affects China. I can do that through mechanizing. But to prove who Trump is would be framing. To say Trump is racist, let's prove that Trump is racist, this is a point of framing, because I'm not proving that Trump is racist as a result of anything. I'm just using illustrations that the average informed voter might be aware of in order to show, look, Trump is racist. And I can try and use that in order to claim certain outcomes. Like I can create mechanizations that use that framing as their presumption and lead to some impact or outcome. I can say Trump specifically wants to prove that he wants to undo Biden's legacy. He wants to undo any policy Joe Biden did. So this would be an argument to the other. This could be an argument to either side, right? If we're right before the election, which is when this motion was being set, for instance, then I could claim Joe Biden has already been tough on China. Trump wants to renege on Joe Biden's policies. Therefore, Trump is going to go closer to China and be less harsh towards China. Or, for instance, to be more concrete, this frame of Trump shows that he is going to avoid green energy, and that's good for China. But the frame of Trump as being racist and America first shows that he is going to be willing to engage in proxy wars, for instance. So different frames that are true in the real world could contribute to proving different arguments. But usually it's going to be best to integrate that frame, in my opinion, into the argument itself. So make it part of the mechanization. Or immediately precedent to the mechanization. But that is generally the distinction between mechanization, proving that something is a product of something else, and just claiming something is true about the world. For instance, there was in a World's ESL semi a few years ago, it was this house would rather be born with an exceptionally high sense of self-awareness than My framing was, look, everyone dies with a great awareness, a degree of self-awareness. When we die, we're aware of the lost dreams and hopes, the time we should have spent with our family, the love we never sought out. We're keenly aware of every bad decision we've made in our lives, and we feel that regret. This motion uniquely gives people the ability to have pre-hoc awareness rather than post-hoc awareness. And by doing that, we're able to avoid all of the regret, all of the disappointment, and live a far more utility maximizing life for ourselves. I didn't yet get into proving anything. All I did was frame something about the world, that most people don't have pre-hoc awareness, they have post-hoc awareness, and that leads them to be sad. I still have burdens I need to prove now. I still need to divide my argument into, okay, one, why are people likely to be aware? Why is people's self-awareness going to be an accurate manifestation? Like, why will it be a good predictor of their actual needs? Two, why do people have the capacity to act out on those needs and preferences? Three, why can't people on the counterfactual just rationalize to themselves and like ignorance is bliss and they're not even aware of how much they're losing out on? So I still need to break it down and prove each of those things separately. But having that framing at the beginning of, this debate is a pre-hoc versus post-hoc awareness is going to make it very easy for me to persuade the judge of what I want. So I want to reshift the judge's focus to something that is true in the real world, just a different focus that you could look at the debate from, and start mechanizing from there. Does that answer your question? Okay, I'm going to move on. Hopefully that does. Yeah, okay, great. I see a thumbs up. Cool. Let's talk about finding burdens of proof. So whenever I have an argument, it's going to have several basic burdens. I have to prove that what I claim is true or likely, that this happens. If it never happens, then I don't really care about it, right? So the first thing I'm going to need to mechanize is likelihood. The second thing I'm going to need to mechanize is importance. Why does this matter? Why do I care about this? Why is this thing good or bad? Because if it's not good or bad, I don't care. If you're just telling me, look, something is really likely to happen, I go, okay, and why should I prioritize that over these other things someone else says that seem like they're a very good or very bad thing? And then the third burden is that what you're saying changes. Because if what you're saying doesn't change in the debate, then it might be very common and very harmful. Like cancer might be common and harmful. But if you didn't persuade me that it's going to change meaningfully, then I feel it's irrelevant to the debate. So your burdens are always likelihood, importance, and comparativity. Note that in comparativity, it's not just this changes, right? We want to prove it changes a lot. Why does the motion make this far more or less or far less likely? Or why does the motion make this manifest in a far better or far worse way? Every time you're debating, if you're stuck, if you know something is an argument, but you're sort of stuck in how to approach it, you can just divide it into these three questions. Why is this likely? Why does this matter? Why does this change? And if you've proven all three of those and you just start analyzing on each of those and you spend your entire time in your speech trying to prove these three questions, you're going to end up with at least a case that stands. And in a moment, we're going to do an exercise. But I also want to talk more broadly about finding burdens of proof. We have to think, in order to prove my argument, do I have to prove this burden? If I don't have to prove this burden, then I don't have to analyze. If this burden isn't crucial for my bottom line, then I don't have to analyze it. I literally have to ask the question, once I have phrased my case and I have phrased my burden, is this burden required in order to prove the line above, or can the line above be proven without it? It sounds silly, but I'm repeating it because many times people end up analyzing burdens that are not crucial for their bottom line. We do the same for rebuttals. Am I rebutting something that is crucial for their bottom line, or am I rebutting something that is tangential to their core argument? Another way to find burdens of proof is to challenge yourself, try and rebut your own case, and go not rebuttals of competing analysis. You say that this could happen, but actually the opposite could also happen because. No. Try to rebut yourself with, there is missing analysis. There is a hole. There is a hole. You don't explain why X. Next, when we find burdens of proof, we want to try and reword our argument to make our bottom line debate winning. Does black market sound debate winning to you? Does it sound strong? I want to give you a quick challenge. Can anyone reword the claim black market to me in a debate about drugs to explain why we should legalize drugs because of a black market claim? And you can take up to a minute. If no one answers in a minute, I'll just give you the answer. And we're going to try and reword this claim, black market, into a debate-winning bottom line. And the importance of turning the bottom lines debate winnings is that that is how we find the correct burdens for them. If I don't word my case in a debate-winning way, then my burdens aren't going to be proving a debate-winning benefit. Unregulated marketplace. Unregulated marketplace did not sound more persuasive. Oh, this looks better. Yes. So majority of addicts still consume drugs, even when it's illegal, but in a far less safe manner than a regulated market. So this is still not inherently debate winning, right? I still need to prove the, could I shed light on prove by myself? Yeah, sure. I'll do that in a moment. So I say majority of addicts consume drugs, even when it's illegal, but in a less safe manner than a regulated market. And this is something that could be debate winning because I'm talking about because I could claim to be talking about a large proportion of people influenced. I could claim a significant harm, less safe manner of consumption. Now, if let's say this was my bottom line, then I'm going to work my burdens back by rebutting this. For instance, I can think to myself, okay, how would I respond to this claim? I would say, one, we don't care about addicts. Addicts don't matter. They're the dregs of society. They put themselves in their own situations. So I might have a burden that I could add. I go, why does the state have an obligation to defend addicts? And then I could say at the very least they're citizens, but also more likely they were directly abandoned or neglected by the state, and the state is a large contributor to the fact they're in their current situation. Or alternatively, even if the state has no contribution, the state has an obligation to people who are citizens of the state and suffering. Okay. So I've answered the attack that why do we care about addicts? What other attacks could I have? Could people attack on me? They could say, but people wouldn't switch to the regulated market. Even if you legalize it, we're still going to keep using it. People are still going to keep using the black market. So I go, okay, so I have a burden of why legalization kills the black market. And so so by thinking, where could I attack? This is a hole. This is a glaring hole. These are glaring holes. Because if we don't, because my burdens are, this is likely, this changes, and this matters. And if people tell me, why do we even care about addicts? Then my case doesn't matter. And if people tell me, but we're still going to keep consuming from the black market, then my case doesn't change. But the specific burdens of the state is obligated towards addicts and a legalization kills off the black market are burdens that are easy for me to come up with if I think, what would I attack from the other side? So the way I could prove that second burden might be that the black market exists primarily due to the high rates. And if we have legalized drugs at lower rates, then then it's going to undercut the cost of the market. Or I could explain that consumers prefer the lower stigma and decreased risk and increased control involved with buying in regulated markets, which is why they're going to do that. Or I could explain that states have an incentive to make sure that these markets are accessible, which is why they're not going to do things like collect your personal information, which they know deters addicts. Those are all illustrations. Sorry, I'm going to refocus a little bit on the flow of the workshop. I see that there's some more questions. We will get to them. So, but as an indicator for where I might do framing in this argument, then my framing might be, okay, I want to explain how much less safe this is, how much greater the risks are. And this is an important burden within my argument, right? This is the question of extent of my benefit, and I should have a full burden in my speech of why are black markets much more dangerous than regulated markets. It should be a full burden, and I should have one mech should be on purity, and another mech should be on quantity, and another mech should be on access to support, right? But I might still start by framing this argument and go, we live in a world where the streets of the United States, the country with perhaps the toughest penalties for dealing and consuming drugs in the developed world, are lined with people addicted to the worst of drugs, and young normative individuals dying by the masses, while in countries like Norway with support with protected shelters where people can access can do heroin and access life-saving support, almost no one ever dies. When people don't die, when that fewer people die, it's also that fewer people who become irrevocably addicted. It's that many fewer people who become who become severely ill or disabled. It's that many fewer people who turn to a life of crime. And I haven't yet analyzed anything. I haven't yet proven anything, right? I shouldn't get credit for this as anything more than an intuition. And that is, but this is framing, because I do this before my speech, and I have reoriented the judge's mindset to, oh my God, actually, yeah, this isn't just a case about druggies get less headaches. This is a case about we save many lives. But I would still rather take that same burden, that same thing where I'm asking, what am I trying to prove with this framing? I'm trying to prove that there is a significant impact. Then let's turn this into a burden. Let's turn this into a burden of why legalized drugs, regulated drugs, are much, much safer than unregulated drugs. And let's integrate that same framing into here. So let's use the framing of, let's have a mechanism called stigma. The drugs on the streets of Copenhagen and how they're treated. And I'm using that very same framing of what does the world look like, but now I'm using that very same intuition, but now I'm using it to prove something more specific, a specific mechanism of stigma. And this is a very useful way to make it so that both your framings and your mechanizations get more credit. Your mechanizations will get more credit if you use real world framings and illustrations. Your framings are going to get more credit if you also mechanize and explain why these things are likely to occur or structurally occur, rather than just empirically can occur. I hope that answers your question, Shivi. Okay. Let's give you an exercise now. I'm going to give you all another question. Oh, there are other populations that can be run in this debate. So in a legalization debate, then we have a population of people who are already addicted. We have a population of people who might become addicted tomorrow, right? So there are population illicit users who are willing to consume on the black market, and there are population legal users who are only willing to consume when it's a legal market. And I can explain that as a state, we have a far greater obligation to protect these people rather than those people. And just because many people engage in something that's bad for them doesn't mean we should make it legal. Many kids smoke vapes. Perhaps if we legalized vapes for kids, then we'd have a better capacity to regulate which vapes kids smoke. We're still not going to legalize vapes for kids because we believe it's unfair to harm those kids who are law-abiding in exchange for those kids who are not law-abiding. I don't know why my example was kids with vapes. The obvious example is just druggies. Like we have current drug users, we have future drug users, or we have but we also have other populations, right? We have populations of criminal organizations who are affected. We have populations of, this is a taxable industry, so we have small business owners which are affected. There are different populations and stakeholders within this debate. Deeptha, so you don't have to do framing before you start your constructive arguments. In fact, my recommendation is you don't. Until you reach the point where you realize, okay, this has to be in my speech and it has to be a framing, it can't be anywhere else, you should avoid doing framing. You should only do framings before your arguments if they are something that has a concrete anchor that you can reference later in your speech, and if it's something that's relevant to all your arguments. Otherwise, you should try and integrate it into a burden within your constructive arguments. Before you introduce it, what I do before I introduce an argument is usually, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. In my speech, I'm going to talk about A, B, and C. Let's begin. My first burden within A is X. That's how I start. I jump right into my constructive. The less time I spend before my constructive, the more time I have to prove more constructive burdens, which means the more cases I can prove. So again, framing can be very useful, but I think it is harder to utilize at lower levels in constructive speeches. So if I want to talk about what the world looks like, I'd rather do that force myself to do that throughout in all of my mechanization, rather than as a separate bit at the beginning. I find that oftentimes when speakers do extensive framing at the beginning, then they frame things that should be analyzed. They frame things that shouldn't be said at all. They frame things that are relevant to arguments that they never managed to prove, because if I spend 3 minutes on framing, then that's going to be relevant because I have framing that's relevant for my next 3 arguments. Then I only managed to run 2 arguments though. So some of my framing becomes irrelevant. Oftentimes an argument can stand without framing, and it can stand without any of the burdens. So analyze your framings last, make that your rule. First, analyze all of your burdens. Then analyze a framing if you have spare time for it. You ask, change the judge's frame of mind on what the debate is about. We can also do that through weighing in WIP. You say, analyze what the world looks like. We can also do that through problem analysis, right? I want to offer, before I give you an exercise, I'll quickly do this before the exercise, then I'll give you the exercise. I want you to also note that in any debate, especially in policy debates, we can think of basic burdens that are integral to the debate. So before we were talking about likelihood, importance, and comparativity. That's a great way to divide burdens. And most of my cases, I'll divide like that. But it can be just as helpful to be thinking, for many of you, to be thinking in terms of problem, solution, outcomes, justification. You have to have a problem, right? Because if there's no problem, if you're a government side trying to change something about the world, and there's no problem in the way the world currently is, why should I change anything? So you have to prove to me that there's a problem. You have to prove that it exists and that it is problematic. Now, I want you to note that it exists is a descriptive element, and it is problematic as a normative element. So before, we were dividing it into the descriptive, normative, and comparative elements separately. Now, within the problem, we can have both a normative and a descriptive element. Secondly, we would have a solution burden. So if the motion doesn't solve the problem that you want to solve, then why would I implement this? Then why would I do this? And even if it does, why should I implement this solution in particular? So your burdens are going to be, why is our solution feasible? Normative or descriptive? Okay, so descriptive means likelihood. So I'm just describing something occurs. I'm not saying at all whether it's good or bad. So the likelihood burden is a descriptive burden. The normative, the importance burden is a normative burden. So something has normative value if it is a good or bad thing that we desire or oppose. So if I say a problem exists, that's descriptive. If I say a problem is problematic, that's normative. Or if I say this case is likely, that's descriptive. If I say this case matters, that's normative. So then we would have, and so finally we would have comparative. So the comparative element of why something changes. So descriptive, normative, and comparative, you want to make sure each of your arguments fulfills them all. Now, so in the solution burden, we have to prove that the solution is feasible or implementable. Sometimes we have fiat, but we can quickly explain that part then. How the solution solves the problem. and why it's better than other solutions, or why it's the only solution that can do it. We don't have to do that last part. We don't have to explain that this is better than any other solution, or that it's the only solution that can do it. But if all we do is explain that our solution solves the problem, OO can stand up and say, okay, we have a counter prop, and our counter prop solves the problem even better. The third burden we would have is outcomes. Why are the outcomes of the problem bad? Why are the outcomes of the solution good? Why are there more bad outcomes than good outcomes, right? So even if the solution has some harms, why are the net positives better than the net harms? And finally, justification. This is a burden that has fallen out of style in recent years, but it is still perfectly relevant, and it is still perfectly workable. So this is both why am I allowed, or why it's legitimate for me to do something. For instance, if I have a motion of this House would enact mandatory military service, military conscription, then I need to prove that I'm allowed to do this, that this is legitimate for me to do. Otherwise, a very strong op would be, you're not allowed to conscript me. I'm actually born free and I live free, and who the heck are you to conscript me? A second form of justification burden would be, why are we obligated to do something or banned from doing something? So, for instance, I could say we are obligated to offer people gender-affirming care. Or I could say we are obligated to allow people access to paternity tests. Or I could say we are, to be clear what I mean by banned from doing this, I mean when we defend changing something, right? So the difference between being allowed to do something or not allowed, and being banned or obligated to do something is extent. So if I'm allowed to do something, it just means it's okay to do it. I'm not prevented from doing it. That's very different from something that I'm obligated or banned from doing, where I say we must do this, or we must revoke this, we must stop doing this right now. If I want to explain that we are allowed to do something, I still have to prove that it is beneficial to do it. If I prove that we are obligated or banned to do something, I don't have to prove that it is beneficial in terms of consequences. Now, I want to give you an exercise. I want to give you a burden, an argument, and I want you to come up with its burdens. And note, we're not yet going to be mechanizing and proving these burdens, but I already want you to be working in the sense of, as soon as I have an argument, the first thing I do is break it down into 2 to 4 constructing blocks, and those are the things that I'm going to need to mechanize and prove. So the first exercise I want to give you is that the black market gives money, supports criminal organizations. So illegal drugs benefits criminals. I want you to rename this argument to make it seem stronger. Still a short name, but just a little stronger and clearer. And then I want you to come up with the burdens you have for it. I'm going to start a 2-minute timer. And feel free to send them in chat. I won't be able to go over everyone's answers, but I'll be able to go over a couple. Yes, so the argument, I'll write it out. Legalizing drugs harms criminals. Your goal is to reword that argument to make it sound debate winning, and then identify what the burdens are to prove the argument. Shivani, that doesn't sound debate winning. Many things incentivize criminal activities. The existence of the upper class incentivizes criminal activities. The existence of tourism incentivizes pickpocketing. Okay. None of you numbered burdens for me. I'm looking for a numbered list of burdens. The first person to give me a claim with then a 1, 2, 3 burdens listed under it is the person who's are the people whose answers I will read out. Again, I'm looking for. Okay, great. Priyansh, let's have a look. Black markets help criminals. Black market is operated by big underground gangs. Most people still want drugs. They have a high supply. They're unregulated. They can do any fishy stuff, probably use addictive substances. It's bad because it makes you more addicted. So you identify some things well. It is correct, for instance, that the burden of there is still demand because people still want drugs is a burden. Not all of these are necessarily the burdens. For instance, saying these drugs are bad because they become more addictive is irrelevant to the argument that this helps criminal organizations. Shashwat, let's see. I'm missing an argument name. Black market is unregulated, hence very safe for criminals to do illegal stuff in, proving incentive. Hold on. A black market is unregulated, not in the sense that the police don't try and crack down on criminals, right? It's unregulated in the sense that no one can tell me, or I ignore the instructions of what I can and can't put in stuff. So this doesn't prove incentive because it's not true that the way it's unregulated makes it safe to do illegal things in. What proves incentive is that there is what proves incentive is that there is continued demand for it. So what proves both incentive and capacity, actually, in this case, is 1, there is enough demand. We're not able to crack down on demand. 2, there's enough supply. We're not able to crack down on supply. You are correct with the third burden of when you legalize drugs, not enough people participate in the black market, or more accurately, when you legalize drugs, almost everyone prefers to consume legalized, regulated drugs than illegal drugs. Risha. So I want to take Daller's response as another example here. Burdens of proof. Why would legalization cause a shift away from the black market? Why is purchasing from the black market bad? Why are legal drugs an okay alternative? This is a generic form of burdening that's not related to the argument on criminal organizations. This is just about any argument about black market is bad. So I want us to note that first we need to give the argument a better name. Should not be something like illegal drugs bad, but perhaps the drug trade is a leading source of income for criminal organizations, which massively increases their capacity and incentive to do bad things like turf wars and bribing and corrupting authorities. So my end impact should still be something like these gangs use this in order to do a lot of harms, right? But then once I say it like that, then I notice my burdens are kind of regular burdens. 1 second, where is the? So these are what we would call cookie cutter burdens. 1, the ban isn't effective. Why is the naming of arguments this way important? Because many of you miss the core of what we're trying to prove by not naming it this way. Let me write it out for you and send it to you to show you how it helps you identify it. So we say illegal drugs are a major source of income for criminal organizations, which creates capacity and incentive for other crimes. The beauty of wording it like this is that, one, it is very clear to me what I claim happens is bad and changes, that illegal drugs are a major source of income for criminal organizations. That's what happens. I claim that it's major, so I claim it happens a lot. And I explain and I already illustrate why I think this is a bad thing, because it creates capacity and incentive for other crimes. This is going to keep me focused the entire time during my analysis on how does this strengthen criminal organizations, or how does the legalization weaken them. And this is important because many of you talk about how, oh, I'm incentivized to sell drugs. But that's not the core of why it's bad. The core of why it's bad is I now have a lot more money and arms to do other crimes as well. Or you talk about why is purchasing from the black market bad? No, that's not the burden. The burden is money going into criminal organizations is used to do bad things. And now that this is my headline, then my burdens are very clear. Some of my burdens are cookie cutter. Whenever I have a black market argument, my burdens are: one, ban isn't effective in preventing supply. Two, ban isn't effective in deterring demand. Now, note, this second burden can change depending on my argument. If my argument is about protecting the most vulnerable users, then I will say the ban isn't effective in deterring demand, at least not among the most vulnerable of users, i.e. those who are most prone to addiction to drugs. If I'm trying to prove that a lot of money goes to criminal organizations, I want to claim ban isn't effective in deterring demand, at least not demand from the wealthiest, highest paying consumers, or the most consistent and profitable sources of income. So perhaps the ban is effective at deterring. What I would argue is, panel, obviously bans are effective at deterring people who would be consuming once a month or less. These are people for whom it is not very important to have access to the drug. They're not very addicted to the drug, and they care more about social stigma and narratives surrounding the drugs. But for people who are regular consumers, i.e. the ones who are the most consistent source of revenue for lower paying drugs, the ones who regularly shell out for higher paying drugs, the ones who have their coke dealer on speed dial, they are not deterred. My third burden is going to be that a black market is significantly worse than a regulated one. In this case, though, I'm not talking about the quality of the materials. I'm talking about where the money goes. So my burden here isn't it's significantly worse. It's criminal organization. Actually, let's so the immediate thing would be criminal organizations use these funds to do very bad things. But a more general way of rewording it could be the drug trade worsens other crimes. And the reason this rewording matters is because it doesn't just worsen other crimes by giving me more money with which I can do other crimes. It also gives me a stronger incentive to take over turf and become the sole seller of drugs in a certain neighborhood. So that creates a race to the bottom between different organizations on who can arm themselves more. Once I have armed up, I'm ruthless, and I trade in drugs, then there's a quick race to the bottom where I'm going to deal in other drugs as well that are worse drugs, because I already have all the network in place. And once I'm already dealing with hard drugs and have a regular supply of arms, then I'm very well poised to start a racketeering business or a robbery business, a robbery cartel, because I already have consistent sources of income that I now want to diversify from. I already have well-trained criminals, etc. And then our fourth burden is just legalization will be effective in abolishing. Now, I want you to know something. You all took some time, came up with some of these burdens. Some of you came up with 4, some of you came up with 1, some of you came up with 3. But I didn't need to come up with any of them because I know that every time I want to run a black market argument, whether it's for prostitution or for drugs or for banning nicotine or alcohol or sugar, then it's going to be the exact same burdens. That's what we call cookie cutter burdens. It makes it a lot easier for me to analyze them because I'm analyzing the correct thing, because I don't get lost because all of my burdens are concretely trying to prove the same argument. And what we're going to soon see in the mechanization part, one second, this is claiming my battery is low, but my thing should be plugged in. So why is my battery low? That is a little concerning because I don't have another laptop to use. Okay, there we go. Fix that. The logical conclusion of reading them? Sure, I'll go over it. If I want to claim a black market exists, then I need to prove that even when it's illegal, even when the cops are patrolling the streets, even when the jails are full of drug addicts, there is still a drug trade. The two burdens here is one, that the ban isn't effective in preventing supply, i.e. that the ban doesn't manage to make it unprofitable to sell drugs, that the ban doesn't manage to crack down on the import of drugs. I explained that synthetic drugs can be made in every lab. I explained that due to the concentration of drugs like fentanyl, but even cocaine, then shipping them is, and due to the mass amounts of global trade, then shipping drugs hidden in other goods becomes very, very easy. I can explain that because it becomes so profitable, because as supply drops, profitability rises because demand for, which I'm going to prove in my next burden, because demand is so high and sticky, then it becomes worth it for people who otherwise don't have any hopes. I can explain that most people don't concept that people have a short-term bias and an optimism bias, and so they don't rationally calculate how unprofitable it is for them to trade in drugs. All this proves that no matter what you do, I'll still be able to buy drugs. Now let's prove there are still enough drug buyers. There are enough drug buyers because, there are always, because drugs are also in many circles glorified, and there's still hippies who like psychedelics, and there's still stoner culture, and I can still listen to Snoop Dogg and want to go get weed, and I can still decide to do a brat summer with cocaine. So that glorification means that we create some form of demand. Secondly, people like doing things that are specifically illegal. It gives them a sense of control and power. Third, drugs change people's mental state. People really, really like changing their mental state. It is a unique experience to them, so they're willing to go to risks in order to be able to access it. All of this, though, is just to prove that enough people do it in the first place that we get to the really important mix. The really important mix are, one, drugs are addicting. Once I start doing them, I keep doing them, even if it's at personal risks. And then 2, drugs lead to worse drugs because you become more accustomed to previous drugs, or because your drugs get laced, or because the drugs get normalized, or because you make more and more druggy friends, and then you try even worse drugs. So that means that you're going to be even more addicted and your demand is going to be even higher. I just gave you 5 separate mechs, all of which independently but also collectively proving that there is still demand despite legal bans on drugs. At this point, I've proven to you that that no matter how severe the punishments you give, the ban is not going to be effective in preventing supply, and the ban is not going to be effective in preventing demand, and therefore, in status quo, there is lots and lots of drug trading at very profitable rates, and that's very harmful. Let's move on to my third burden. Criminal organizations use these funds to do very bad things. So I could say first, this is just a lot of funds. So it gives them a lot of capacity. Why is it a lot of funds? Because my previous two burdens prove it's a lot of funds. Beyond it being a lot of funds, it also, because we reworded it after all to say the drug trade worsens other crimes. So let's say one, I get a lot more capacity because I have a lot more drugs. Two, I have a lot more incentive to be fighting other criminal organizations and to be arming up in order to protect my drug trade. I have also a lot more capacity to arm up because I have more contacts, i.e. international smugglers from whom I can easily get weapons along with the drugs. And then I can say three, there becomes a race to the bottom between these gangs, and they each become worse than the last. At this point, I've proven to you that the drug trade is common, harmful, and then my first mechanism here would be why at that point it also becomes profitable to do racketeering and corruption and all the other forms of crime. And now I've given you 4 mechs for why this drug trade is a very large and unique contributor to worsening other crimes. At this point, after these 3 burdens, I've proven to you that the drug trade is common, unstoppable by banning it, and leads to very severe harms. Now let's explain why legalization will be effective in abolishing the black market. 1, because I can likely reach cheaper prices because I don't have to factor in the risk of doing business and the cost of doing business. 2, it's healthier materials. They're less laced. It's easier for me to control exactly how many quantities I have. 3, it's a more comfortable shopping experience. Like it's far more normalized and standardized, and it doesn't feel icky and iffy and dangerous, right? Like a dark alleyway and my Telegram dealer, I don't really know them. 4, there's a lot less stigma and a lot more access to help if I do it legally. 5, at that point, the risk calculus of I could get caught by police, even if it's a small risk, becomes massive because few people are still consuming drugs illegally, so it's far easier for the police to catch them, and I get far less of a benefit because I have alternative access to those drugs. And now I've proven to you that legalization is going to be effective, uniquely effective in abolishing the black market, taking away a massive source of income for these criminal organizations. As soon as I separated the burdens clearly, mechanizing them became easy. Because I don't have any of this written down, any of these mechanisms I just told you. But I don't need to, because I've debated black market debates before. And if I consistently approach them in a way that goes, they have the same burdens, like there's this, the same cases are going to continue having the same burdens, and the same burdens are going to continue to be proven in pretty similar ways, the mechanization becomes very easy. Okay. I want to give you 2 more examples of cookie cutter burdens. You should all be writing this down. You should all think of ways to analyze these burdens because it's going to come up in multiple debates. Another example of cookie cutter burden is a principle of choice and autonomy. I need to prove first that the choice is important or a right that we should care about. So I need to demonstrate, for instance, what benefits we get when we allow people to have this choice and what harms we get when we ban people from having this choice. Secondly, I need to explain that the choice is free, informed, and rational on our side. If it's not free, informed, and rational, then I can justify paternalistic intervention. I can say, yeah, people should generally be free when their decisions lead to outcomes in their best interests, but that's not what happens here. This leads to outcomes that are against people's best interests. Specifically in a way that they are irrational or unfree, and not just a bad choice, but like an irrational choice. Third, I need a burden of why the choice primarily affects the choice maker. Otherwise, I can justify limiting the choice to protect others. Choice and autonomy. Let's see. What you guessed? Well, I'll repeat the first burden in a moment. I'll say the last one first. Finally, that the choice is harmed. So the first burden is the choice is important. The second and third burdens are the ways we engage preemptively with what opposition are going to say. The choice is free, and the choice primarily affects me. The last burden is that the choice gets harmed. If the choice isn't important, my argument isn't important. If the choice isn't free, informed, and rational, it's going to be very easy to attack me. If the choice doesn't primarily affect the choice maker, i.e. my choice to walk around naked primarily affects many people who see me naked, then it is legitimate to prevent that choice. And the choice must be harmed, either under status quo or under the motion, right? That's the comparative element of the burden. So a way we can think about it is that the first burden I mentioned, that the choice is important, is the normative burden. The last burden I mentioned, that the choice is harmed under status quo, is the comparative burden. And the second and third burdens, that the choice is free and that the choice primarily affects the choice maker, are meta burdens. They're burdens that we need to do within the normative burden, and we need to do them because that's where we're going to get attacked. Yeah, so Shashwat, your summary of choice and autonomy is correct. I just integrated the fourth and fifth burdens. I think that oftentimes saying y on one side X, y on the other side Y is less efficient than integrating it into y more on side X than on side Y. Finally, on a message, so I want you to know that all of these burdens similarly can have consistent types of mechanizations. So for instance, smoking. What I would say is, and these are types of consistent mechs I can have. One, we can limit specifically the instances of the choice when they affect others. For instance, we can make it illegal to drink alcohol while pregnant or to smoke in public outside of designated smoking zones, while still making it legitimate for people to smoke and to drink. So when people get drunk, that primarily affects themselves. Things that they might do while drunk, like driving, affects others. So we can ban driving while drunk. Or a second sort of classy way of proving this third burden is to say the way at which it influences others is not a way we care about. So for instance, when I get tattoos, or if I do any other change to my body, this can make people who are close to me unhappy. So for instance, if I go through a sex change, then my conservative parents might have an experience as though their son is dying. However, we don't care. We don't care about how, because we believe that affecting others does not count if others are affected just because they care about how I'm affected myself. And I can give many illustrations for this. I might be very unhappy with how other people raise their kids or live their lives, but I don't get a right to intervene in that. It doesn't matter if I don't like seeing two men kissing. I have no right to intervene in those two men kissing because the way it affects me is an illegitimate way. It's a way where I just decide that I want to inflict my morals on others. And so we actually don't care about the effect on others when others see it and they go, oh no, because, sucks to be them. So for instance, in a debate where I would want to explain why we should make, no, actually that's not a great example. I'll leave it at that. Does that answer your question, Shashwat? Okay, great. Finally, and then we're going to talk more about mechanization, a message argument. I want you to take 2 minutes to tell me what the burdens of a message argument are. So a message argument is any time I want to explain that a group of people is influenced by a narrative or by a claim or by something being platformed. I want to claim people see art of this type or another, or people see political messaging of this type or another, and this influences them. Let's read Rishap's question. Oh, it's so my second mech there within the third burden was to try and illustrate the second thing you said, that the harm of the choice on a bystander is too minuscule, or it's not exactly about it being minuscule, so being an illegitimate type of choice. So I might get very emotionally distraught by something. And so it's not a minuscule impact. It's a consequentially significant impact that we still don't care about. So where do we impose our morals onto others? That's a great question. and then we'll circle back to message. So generally, I think that morals that are aesthetic preferences are morals that should not be imposed on others. For instance, a dress code is an aesthetic preference. There are, of course, borderline questions of where aesthetics become normatively important. So we can be against nudism because we think it has meaningful harms to others. And it might, I might go, oh, we're against nudism because children are exposed to nudism, and that's bad. Okay, how about nudism in the workplace then? Well, no, because I should still have the right to choose not to be exposed to someone's naked body. Okay, why should I have that right and not, where does that right end? Why is it okay for me to tell someone, oh, goodness me, put a shirt on, you're in a workplace for crying out loud, but not legitimate for me to say, oh, goodness me, cover your elbows, you're in a workplace for crying out loud. Some things are a measure of societal convention. Or freedom of speech as well. So surely my freedom of speech is something that is very important. We all agree it's very important. But freedom of speech gets limited by others' preferences. So free speech radicals would say it never should. I should always have the freedom to say whatever I want, no matter how vile it is. And you should have the freedom for me to face social repercussions for it. But no one should prevent me from saying what I want to say. In fact, many would argue that freedom of speech only ever matters when we talk about things we don't want to hear. No one's fighting for my right to say, oh, good day, isn't it? We're fighting for my right to say, those damn immigrants. Because if all I'm saying is beautiful day, isn't it? There's no discussion. Everyone agrees that I should have that right. Freedom of speech only becomes interesting when I say things people disagree with, or many people disagree with. And it would be very arbitrary for us to say, oh, if 80% of people disagree with you, then it should be allowed. But if 99% of people disagree with you, it shouldn't be allowed. So a free speech absolutism claim would be that any limitations on my speech, including limitations on hate speech, even though their consequences could be severe, still are an imposition of our own personal morals onto others in an illegitimate way. A good response to this would be many laws are arbitrary impositions of preferences onto others' morals, freedoms, and we do this in order for society to function. You have the freedom to move as fast as you want and wherever you want, but then we define that actually you can't enter parks in certain public parks in certain hours, and you can't drive above the speed limit. We are imposing onto your very basic human rights limitations in order for society to function cleanly. So those are some ways that I would suggest to explain this question. So to explain both an intuition for where I would argue, oh no, don't impede on morals, and a way to explain why we should impede on morals. I would say generally this is a question that the best way to create analysis for is to ask these philosophical questions, try and find answers in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, ask questions in serious posting, and try and work it out for ourselves how we would analyze this in different cases, because obviously there are core ways of analyzing it, but it changes depending on each debate and example. Cool. That was a longer answer than I should have given to a tangential question, but I really like the question, so I allow myself. On messages. So let's see. So you're all right. You're all correct about how is the message propagated. So how does it spread? There's also a question of what is the message, right? We need to start by defining what the message is. You're correct that there's a question of what is the likely interpretation. So in what setting do people consume, or with who do they engage about it? So what is likely interpretation and by whom? And then how are they likely to react to this message? Absolutely. So how do they change their behavior, or what is the motivation? So Shashwat, very correct answers. Priyansh, very close, correct, and worded very closely. What you're often missing is what's the comparative? So what is the alternative messages people engage with? And the most common rebuttal you're always going to get when you talk about a message is, but people are also exposed to this competing message. So you always want to explain, in the absence of this narrative, which other narratives are likely to be dominant. For instance, explaining dominant X is the dominant narrative, but in the absence of dominant X, narrative Y is likely to be dominant, because narrative Y is generally a very strong narrative that beats out other narratives, and narrative X is uniquely poised to take it over narrative Y. Would be a good way of doing that. Now, for these burdens too, there are consistent, regular ways of how we can think of our mechanisms. So how does the message spread? We're going to very consistently go, okay, so is it spread directly to viewers, i.e. I watch the show? Is it spread through criticisms, critiques, and like social discussion? Is it spread from word of mouth? Some narratives are spread mostly by our grandparents sharing wisdom with us. Like, this house opposes the narrative that X is a virtue. When we want to talk about what actions are motivated by interpretations and why those are the actions, then we often want to think, we can think now, you can stop and think, what are the types of actions that can be motivated by a message? So a change in my behavior towards people, a change in my voting patterns, a change in my internal talk or beliefs towards myself, a change in my goals that I define for myself. So these are all potential things that I want to keep in mind when I try to mechanize this burden. That you identified. Good job with that. Tanisha, that question about WIPs is out of the scope of this debate. What I can tell you briefly is it's very hard to beat other teams with no standing material. You have to fully take down and flip their cases. Even if you mitigate them 99%, they'll still beat you if you don't have a standing case. So you always want to start by making sure that your case stands, and only then start engaging with others. Secondly, I'll note that weighing often explains why an argument wins out over multiple different arguments. So weighing can often be used against, rather than just one argument or one claim, against an entire team or all three other teams at once. So it's more efficient use of time. Rebuttals are useful when we're able to take down an important link. Without the link, the argument doesn't stand. If we identify the weakest link and most efficient one to take down, that's a very efficient use of rebuttal. But oftentimes the way we rebut things is we go, okay, this is their core burden, it's sensible, they give some mechs, let's attack each mech, let's do line by line rebuttal, attacking each mech and giving competing analysis. That's going to take a lot of time. That's going to be very difficult for you to do anything else. So make sure your case stands into rebuilding, weigh it against other teams, and then rebut weak burdens that are important for other teams. Okay. The order of the burdens for the narrative. Yes, so it's roughly the order that people also wrote in chat. First, it's just, what is the message? What does it look like? Where do people encounter it? Then it's, what is the likely interpretation of the message? So who is processing it? How do they interpret it? Third is, what action do they do as a result? And fourth is, what is the alternative? So you can think of it as message, interpretation, action, alternative, in order to keep it like clear. Can you even turn that into an M-I-A and then dear C, Mayak-ish. No. Okay, so just remember those four words: message, interpretation, action, alternative. Cool. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to talk about how we mechanize a burden. So general rules of thumb, and I'm going to reference the things that we talked about until now about this. Then If we have time, I might say, like, I might give you one or two examples. Actually, I'll probably just do this until for the next 8 minutes, and then anyone who wants to stay behind for extra questions or exercise, then I'll be happy to do it. So how do we mechanize a burden? The first thing we do is the burden itself should be worded in a way that it's a very clear sentence that can be proven. It shouldn't be like if we look at the examples that we did above, then scrolling back to the black market, then we're not going to say just something like incentive or capacity. We're going to say a ban can't prevent supply. A ban can't prevent demand. Therefore, we can't prevent incentive and capacity. Once we've clearly defined the burden, we want to think of several mechs. Each mech should have a number, 1, 2, 3. Each mech should have a name. So it should have some brief 1 to 4 letter name that comes at the beginning of the mech. This will make it very easy for your partner to do rebuilding. It'll make it very easy for the wing who supports you to reference your mechs in panel versus the wing who doesn't support you. This will make it very easy for judges to credit each of your mechs separately and not see them as blending into each other. Each mech should be numbered, each mech should be named. I want to talk a bit about the process of doing this. First, we come up with our arguments. Then we come up with the burdens. Then we come up with the names of the mechs for each burden. Only then do we write out the entire mech. We don't analyze top to bottom, we analyze left to right. So, and only then we start adding even more micro examples and illustrations and writing out full sentences and all that. This is the best way to use our time and make sure that we have enough material. This is the best way to make sure that we don't miss any burdens. And once we don't miss any burdens, the best way to make sure we have at least a standing mech for each burden by making sure that we have a few ideas that make sense, that we're able to improvise during our speeches if we need to. Note, we don't have to have many mechs. The good rule of thumb is to have 3 or 4, but the alternative is to have 1 or 2 that have depth. So explaining in detail a mechanism by which X affects Y. If you want, during the questions time, I can give an example for this. We also want to order our mechs correctly. I often reorder my mechs after I've come up with them. First, we want the easiest and quickest to prove mechs to come first. We want the judge to already buy us at a certain threshold, and we want the judge to have that minimum threshold of buying us rise as quickly as possible. It'll be easier for judges to buy more complicated mechs after they've already bought simpler, more obvious mechs. So this also is a good way to force yourself to practice the heuristic of how easy to prove is this mech. Should I get rid of this mech and eliminate it? Because if I already have 3 other simpler mechs, maybe I should. We also want the reasons to be freestanding, but have a sensible flow. You'll notice with the burden selection we did, that there was a sensible flow to the burdens, right? With the message. It's first, what is the message? Then how do I interpret the message? Then how that I saw? Then how do I act based on the message I interpreted? Each of these burdens builds upon the previous one. This is important because it means it's easy for us to reference previous burdens and later burdens. We do the same in mechs. We want to be able to reference previous mechs in later mechs. So, for instance, you'll notice when I was meching out the black market argument on why there is continued demand, then I realized that a very important mechanism is people are addicted. But first, I wanted to explain that there are many reasons for people to initially use drugs before they get addicted. So I'll start with the 3 mechanisms of popular culture glorification, social pressures and social desire to consume together, and human curiosity and desire for altered mental states. And only then I'll go into people get addicted. And then I'll go into, and then my 5th mech, which might be the strongest one, for why we can't fight back on demand. That addiction is so strong that people end up consuming worse and worse drugs over time that are more and more expensive, harder and harder to produce, and harder to regulate against. That fifth mech flows wonderfully from my fourth mech, because if people are already addicted, then they're consuming a lot, which means that their bodies become accustomed to it, and they can no longer get the same highs, which means that they're more likely to spend more of their time around other drug users who are likely to consume other drugs, and it means that they are an easier target for their dealer to offer a free bundle of some harder drug or actively lace their own drugs. My fifth mech stems from my fourth stems from my first three. You might go, Ayal, why do you need 5 mechs? Because I can go through the first 3 very quickly. I can spend 20 seconds on each of the first 3, and then 40 seconds on the last 2. And then, yeah, I will have spent 2.5 minutes on this burden. But in this burden, I will have proven that there is immense, massive demand that can never be cracked down against. And I'm going to utilize this burden in order to prove my next burden, which is why we can't crack down on supply. And one of the biggest reasons we can't crack down on supply is because it's just so darn profitable. Because demand is so sticky, it's so profitable. The smaller supply gets, the more profitable it becomes, because you have more demand for a lower quantity of supply, and quickly the price rebounds back up. This is a price that anyone living in poverty who doesn't have a strong respect for or fear for laws, it becomes profitable for them, immensely profitable. And that's why it might be worth it for me to do those 5 mechs. But it was still but I might not. I might just do 3 mechs. But still, I illustrated to you how those mechs flow from each other and the ordering between them. Note that each of them is freestanding. They're not dependent on the previous ones, but they flow nicely into the later ones. In each of these mechs, we want to integrate illustrations. If I have a framing on how it's very easy to produce synthetic drugs, no. I'm going to integrate that into a mech called difficulty of cracking down on small local suppliers, or the mech would be called small local suppliers, and I'm going to integrate that illustration into there. Or I'm not going to frame that drugs are still lauded in society. I'm going to turn that into a mech in my burden, in my first burden, but I'm still going to utilize those illustrations. Finally, I want you to note that we need to connect our specific mechs to the specific impacts and weighings we have. My impacts should sound like they flow from my mechs and vice versa. If there's a clear impact that I want to aim for, I want to make sure that my mechs sound like they lead to it. Same for my weighings. If I want to weigh that we affect the greatest quantity of people, or that we affect people with the greatest certainty, I need to make sure that my mechs are mechs that are proving quantity or certainty. I want to quickly offer some methods with coming up with mechs. First is what we already talked about cookie cutter mechs. Whenever you have consistent burdens, you can have pretty consistent mechs that lead to them. So for instance, let's say you need to mechanize, take this as homework, the very same burdens that we talked about for a black market of drugs argument, I want you to mechanize for a black market of prostitution argument. I want you to explain both how a black market of prostitution harms users, or ideally the prostitutes, actually, the employees. And I want you to explain how it benefits criminal organizations and how it's utilized in conjunction with other types of crimes. And I want you to note that many of the same mechs that I gave could also be given for prostitution. Secondly, you want to consider which relevant actors exist in the debate. So, for instance, let's see which debate do I have. What example do I have for this? Round 8 of Worlds, with this house supports the use of la mano dura policies in areas with high crime rate in Latin America. From opening government, you want to explain that it's effective at stopping crime. So you want to explain that these mechanisms, that tough on crime policies are good for getting deterrence and incapacitation. An easy way of thinking of impacts is through actors. How does tough on crime policy empower police officers to do their work better? How do tough on crime policies empower the DEA and the CIA and the like, or the equivalents? Like, how do they empower espionage organizations to do their job better? What other actors? How does it empower politicians to act better? How does it empower prisons to be more effective? How does this empower, or how does this utilize the United States more as an ally in fighting against crime? So by thinking of different actors through which mechanization can occur, I can come up with mechs, and those mechs can be enough for me. I can go, my first mech is that we have far more, is that soldiers on the ground are far more, that police on the ground are far more effective, so we get far more incapacitation of foot soldiers from the other side. Second, SWAT and other and DEA and other espionage teams are far more effective, so we're far better at like crackdown operations, like assassinating leaders of these crime organizations. Third, we get far more support from the United States, which means we get more weapons, but more importantly, we get better espionage involvement, such as the best satellites. So that's a nice way to come up with mechs. Finally, analyzing and bolding the words of the motion, especially in longer motions or motions with info slides or anything that has brackets and like examples inside the brackets. There's lots to do there for coming up with direct mechs. Finally, it's practice. I can come up with mechs in my sleep because I've spent most of my debate speeches for most of my life mechanizing. And sure, impacting is important and framing is important for a member. But the framing only matters if you can mechanize a case that utilizes it, and the impacting you can only claim if your mechanization can claim it. Practicing mechanization, you can do it every day. You can do a little 50-minute PM prep with your goal to be to mechanize to identify your core burdens, like identify your argument as quickly as possible, identify your burdens as accurately as possible, and then just spend the rest of your time mechanizing them. PMs don't have to have framing or impacting. PMs can just be pure mechanizing. You can let your deputy do the impacting and framing. They shouldn't. You shouldn't just do mechanizing, but you could. Okay. Finally, I want to note that thinking about uniqueness for mechanisms. So what about the thing in the motion uniquely leads to the outcomes is the way to do high-level mechanization. I'm not going to teach you right now how to do that, but I'll tell you that thinking of uniqueness in mechanizations and mechanisms is going to be very powerful. Okay. That's it in terms of the lecture part. I'm available here for any questions you may have. You can write them in chat. You can open your mics if you'd like. If you have no questions, then thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful, and you're free to go. We can practice mechanizing alone, definitely. Every time we practice writing a speech on our own, our goal should be to primarily be writing mechs. About 5 out of 7 minutes of your average PM or member speech should be mechanizing in most debates. About 2 minutes should be framing, weighing, impacting. 5 minutes should be mechanizing, which the process to do this is in your own prep. You, as quickly as possible, choose a case, any case, because the goal is to practice impact, is to practice mechanizing here. It's not necessarily to practice choosing the best case, right? Choose any case that you know is a relevant case in the debate. It's strong, it's relevant. Identify the burdens, and the rest of the time just spend coming up with mechs that prove the burden. Independent sentences that each separately prove the claim that is being made in the burden. In terms of 15-minute preps, then let's say I'm PM. I'll tend to spend the first 7 or 8 minutes coming up with my arguments and burdens, and then the last 7 minutes analyzing my case, so doing the mechanization. But obviously already earlier in prep, I still have mechanisms in mind because I want to make sure that I'm selecting arguments that I have the capacity to later prove. How exactly do we rebut the black market claim? So you first, the claim is just true. Like the black market does bring a lot of revenue in for criminal organizations, and it does harm users who use it more than those same users would be harmed by legal. You can still fight on it, right? You can still say, no, actually, we do significantly crack down on most drugs because we are able to affect supply to a significant extent. You could try and argue about it. The better thing to do there is weigh. To say, even if you're right, and the entire population currently using drugs would be better off, we think that far more people would use drugs tomorrow. We think there are many law-abiding citizens who are deterred. And we are going to impact and weigh that population above. So I could claim that the delta between being addicted, being not addicted to anything and being addicted to a safe drug is much larger than the delta between being addicted to a safe drug and being addicted to an unsafe drug. I can claim there's no such thing as a truly safe drug. So I'd rather protect the population who are transitioning between no drugs at all and some drugs, and the population who are transitioning between some drugs on the black market and some drugs in the legal market. Or I could try and flip the impact on criminals. I could claim, actually, we want criminal gangs to be focused on fighting each other for turf instead of focused on doing things that are more harmful to the greater public. We think it's great when there are criminal industries where people sort of opt into it. Like most of the people being harmed by gangs that focus on drugs are drug users and gang members, and both of those groups opt in to some extent. Next question. So yeah, so that's what. So I already answered the 15-minute prep. In a 20-minute prep, then I would take up to 5 minutes selecting my arguments, up to 5 minutes identifying my burdens, and then 10 minutes to analyze. Most of that time should go to mechanization. But obviously, don't forget your impacts. Impacts are important. But like if you prove your mechs, then it's usually easier to claim your impacts than vice versa. How do you do burden identification during a round? So that's a great question. One, notice if it is a cookie cutter. If it's not a cookie cutter, then consider whether you can easily prove it with just basic burdens, right? Normative, descriptive, comparative burdens, or problem, solution, outcomes, justification as burdens. Oftentimes, the more nuanced burdens are burdens that we come up with by thinking where we're going to be attacked. And it's hard to, and we need to dedicate some time to predicting that. If we don't predict that, it's not the end of the world, right? Because hopefully if we don't come up with it, then our opponents also won't come up with it. But as we regularly engage in competitions with people who are power matched with us, power paired with us. Sorry. Do you guys like cats? Do you want to see my cat? That are power paired with us, then hopefully we should be able to come up with similar arguments to them. And hopefully over time, then we learn to predict what sort of arguments, what sort of rebuttals we're going to get. This is also something that you utilize with your partner. So oftentimes the second speaker should be better at identifying vulnerabilities. That way, at the very least, you won't miss obvious and really small burdens. You're just going to miss more nuanced burdens. If your burden is likely and it matters and it changes, then you're standing. Very often, the burden people are most likely to miss is, why does this motion change it? And my suggestion is to reword that burden instead to include the word significantly. Why does this change significantly under the motion, or uniquely or exclusively? I think that's a good way to make sure that you make the comparative burden more robust, and then you're less likely to miss small burdens sort of within the comparative burden. Next. Right, it is very hard to weigh new mechs. You have to be very good at mechs in order to weigh new mechs. You have to be able to say in a way that is accurately predictive of judges to not only whether a case stands, but to what extent it stands and how persuasive are certain mechs likely to be. I am a very good mechanizer, and still, if my top half have mechanized something, even though this is my biggest strength, usually we'll just opt to run a horizontal instead of a vertical. It is difficult to run verticals on proven burdens. What you need to do, if you're going to do it, is explain out loud either why each of your mechs is better than an equivalent mech in your opening, or what is the problem with the mechanization from your opening. Say, look, this first mech at most proves this, but it doesn't prove that. The second and third mechs are interesting, but they're assertive. We don't think they're proven. I did this. I was extending on Chris and Tajay in Oxford. In some, actually, let me pull up that example because there's only one further question, and that further question is very similar to this question. So let me pull up the Oxford round, the LSE round 4. Yeah, so it was a motion that was worded wackily. Some women's peace movements employ traditional, this was at the round 4 at the LSE Open 2025. Some women's peace movements employ traditional activist tactics such as protests and lobbying. They seek to deconstruct the structures of patriarchy while fighting for peace, draw connections between militarism and patriarchy in their advocacy, and ensure peace agreements address gender concerns. Other women's peace movements employ alternative tactics that weaponize traditional gender norms, including organizing sex strikes to influence male partners in conflicts, invoking their status as mothers to demand a voice in peace discussions, and forming physical barriers using female bodies that cultural norms protect. This house believes that women peace movements should embrace tactics which weaponize traditional gender norms instead of traditional peace tactics. What wackily worded motion, like genuinely just, and that's how even a great team like Oxford A stand up in OG and they say, this is going to be an effective way of negotiating peace, of getting better peace. It's going to be an effective way of getting male soldiers to be less violent sexually on the battlefield. It's going to be an effective way of getting soldiers to kill fewer civilians. I stood up and I said the following. I'm going to prove better why these tactics are effective at persuading people to opt for peace. OG give 2 reasons. This is my first burden. I want to explain the problem with OG's reasons. OG give 2 reasons why our own side is efficacious at changing minds, hearts, and behaviors. First, they say that sex strikes make soldiers do less violent sexual crime. As COPOI, this only works if the soldier is wed. Sex strikes against the dad don't make the son do less violence. If anything, it could make those soldiers more horny and desperate. Secondly, mothers tell people that they lost, OG say that mothers tell people they lost sons, and this is a powerful message. Why? How? Why is it enough? Why is it unique to our side of the debate? Surely everyone knows mothers lose sons. Dads also lose sons. Why is it worse to lose a son as a mom than a dad? This may be a correct mechanism, but it's not analyzed. Then they say that the language of progressivism is less convincing than the language of conservatism. But why? They don't explain why the language of weaponized actions, which is still a feminist action and still a pro-peace movement action, actively effective on our side. OG, therefore, at most prove that on op side there is no efficacy. But in order to win this debate, a team has to show positive efficacy, and none of OG's reasons for positive efficacy work. Now let's get into our reasons. And I gave 4 significantly stronger mechs. 1, cultural norms around not harming women and standing to literally block fighting, think Tiananmen Square, as in using women's bodies to prevent war. 2, cooperating directly with women on the other side. 3, weaponize refusing to have kids in a country with a long-standing conflict. Okay, maybe not all my mechs are better than my openings, but at least 2 of my mechs were better than my openings. But still, I spent a lot. I only did this in an instance where my opening very clearly failed to make the point, where I was confident that I could explain why they failed to make the point, and then I can do my own deepening. It's very difficult to win if they've already proven the point and you're just proving it to a greater extent. You have to quantify the extent. You have to say maybe they persuade X number of people to do Y degree of change, but we persuade Z number of people to do Z prime number of change. For instance, if I can explain that I reach far more people, I might persuade more with my mechanisms. If I explain that my mechanisms are far more present, or that my mechanisms are have a lot more capacity to be implemented or to self-implement. But I have to prove a case like at least 3 times as well as my opening did. Because I need the judges to credit my case at least 2.5 times as well as my opening did. Because if all I proved is twice as what my opening did, then they prove X, I prove 2X, I have 1X added margin. It's not enough to win. What's a good litmus test to check what mechs to run or not? Does the mech answer the burden? Does the if it does, do I have enough mechs that answer the burden? If I do any of these mechs particularly long and cumbersome, or are they particularly susceptible to rebuttal, or are they particularly weaker than the others? If so, I should cut those. If multiple of my mechs seem susceptible or weak or cumbersome, I should try and think of other mechs. So a good litmus test is 1, does it prove this burden? 2, do my mechs collectively sufficiently prove this burden? 3, is this mech susceptible to responses? Is it cumbersome? Is it a safe bet or is it risky? How do you use burdens to shield arguments preemptively? Afraid to make certain claims. So if a claim is required, then you have 2 things to do that are both equally susceptible. You could either explain the claim and you're susceptible to response, or you could explain that the claim actually isn't required and you're susceptible to response. It sounds like the second strategy has not been working too well for you, Shashwat. So I suggest reverting to the first strategy. Try proving it anyway. If what you find is that you end up with too many burdens, then either 1, maybe you need to do a little less preemption. Maybe you're preempting very specific rebuttals instead of preempting more general things. Maybe you need to run fewer cases. Maybe you identify many burdens, and so it's hard for you to run many cases. Maybe you need to have leaner analysis within each burden. So I'm a speaker who tends to have fewer burdens, more analysis on each burden. Some speakers have less analysis on each burden, more separate burdens. Maybe that second strategy is better for you, and you should practice proving burdens with just 1 or 2 mechs. Smaller burdens can often just be proven with 1 mech. Cool. I think that's all the questions. If anyone has any further questions, now is your last chance. If not, I thank you all very much. I hope this was helpful and beneficial. And best of luck in your future training and advancements. When would you know how many mechs are enough? Generally, I go for 2 to 4 mechs, and I try and identify how much these mechs